Hello everyone, welcome to the Worldviews podcast. My name is Han Song Lee, and I'm beyond thrilled today to be joined by Ambassador On from Korea. We do live in a time when the whole idea of globalization and multilateralism are being tested, and we also hear a lot about the alternative ways to look at international relations, a third way, an alternative path, a middle power approach, but also this intertwinement, right, between the socio-economic concerns and the security concerns. For all of these questions, I think we have no better guest than Ambassador On, who is really an incredible diplomat with tremendous experiences across the board, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, East Asia, and at the UN as the permanent representative of Korea to the United Nations. So I'm so glad that we have you here, Ambassador On. So I should really say 환영합니다.
Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for being with us. And let me start with a question about Korea in relation to the world. Maybe you have spotted that we have quite a collection of books on the JFK legacy here, and we're actually supported by our colleagues and interlocutors from the JFK Library. And when I think about JFK, I immediately start thinking about the connection between the civil rights movement at home and the idea of global citizenship abroad. And you talk a lot about global citizenship. So perhaps I can help our audience contextualize you and Korea by asking you, what is the connection between Korea's own experiences, historical memories from the 70s, from the industrial development to the democratization, the reforms, and into its own global image, right, as the Korea that we understand it today, the voice that you curated, and the vote you casted when you were ambassador to the UN. How do we get here from a Korean perspective?
Well, it's not surprising that you have books about JFK here, because we are at Harvard University. And Professor Lee, or Han Song, thank you for having me today. And, I still remember when I was in the middle school in Korea, in South Korea, we had English teachers who came from Peace Corps. Peace Corps was started by JFK, and they sent young people to developing countries, and many of them were teaching English. So I actually learned English from my late mother, who was an English literature professor. But I learned English from primary school. But most Korean kids those days started learning English from the middle school, and quite often from teachers from Peace Corps. And South Korea has come a long way since then. And of course, even during my time in the Korean Foreign Service, which started in 1978, and I retired from the service in 2016. So I was in the service over 30 years. And so one generation I spent in the Korean Foreign Service. During that time, South Korea changed a lot, very dramatically. And when I first started out, South Korea was very much a developing country, and actually until early 1970s, North Korea was more advanced than South Korea. North Korea's per capita GDP was larger than South Korea's in the 1960s. And I sometimes get questions about what is the secret to South Korea's fast economic and social development. It's not easy to say, but sometimes people point out that we had the right development strategy, including industrial policies. When we had a president who was a dictator, President Park, and after that we got democracy. So some people think because we achieved fast economic growth under dictatorship, it was possible for us to switch to democracy. I don't know if it comes in that order. I'm not sure. But that's what happened to us. And after we became a democracy, there was a lot of social change, and we tried to achieve development in more comprehensive way, including in terms of social development and also cultural changes that took place over a relatively short period of time. That's where South Korea is right now, I think.
Great. And you mentioned the transition from just industrial prosperity into democracy, and maybe I can take this opportunity to tell you that one of my favorite TV series, Para is very popular outside Korea as well. And for me, the moment in 1988 resonates a lot with me in my memory of 2008 in Beijing. And if I can just zoom into the microcosm of the two sisters in the Chung family, the elder sister Chumbara was in the streets, the social turmoils towards the end of the military rule, and she wanted to be a judge, but that really complicated things for her, while her younger sister was trying to represent and march with the delegation from Madagascar. And because you're a diplomat, you know that Madagascar eventually answered the call from North Korea to boycott the Olympics. So she had nobody to represent, and she was really sad. Eventually, she did go with Uganda. But really, this twin story of Korea thinking about democracy and also going into the Olympics and trying to project a new image to the world really is very telling to me. And I wonder, from that point of view, right, how do you compare Korea's experience, right, navigating its institutional reforms at home and image abroad with other developing nations at the time? You served in Brazil. In 1988 was when Brazil was ending its own military dictatorship and was transitioning to democracy, although the economy was a bit tricky. How do you rise out of the whole so-called middle-income trap, and how do you deal with a very extractive economy that's not innovating? But you also served in Malaysia. There was a constitutional crisis, although Malaysia was also kind of off to a great economic start. In Singapore was positioning itself as the trade hub of Southeast Asia. So how do you see these parallel stories of nations in the 70s and 80s and 90s rising and navigating that kind of path?
Well, when it comes to economic and social development of these countries you mentioned, it's not easy to compare them and try to come up with a kind of formula. If there is a formula means that if you apply that to any country, that's going to work. But I don't know if there is any formula about when it comes to economic and social development. But there must be some things that are common to, for example, the so-called four dragons in East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So there might be some things that are common. Nowadays, you should count China in as well. But anyway, the term four dragons were used before China's economic
and trying to learn from the four examples, right? And just a bigger dragon in econometric terms.
So, for example, all of them put emphasis on the importance of education. For example, when I was a kid in 1960s, South Korea's per capita GDP was lower than $100. Half of all African countries already reached $100. So South Korea was a very poor country, but still, our parents sent our kids to schools, and our primary education enrollment rate already reached 90%. Africa's primary enrollment rate reached 80% after the MDGs, meaning in 2015. So in 1960s, when South Korea was poorer than most African countries, South Korea's primary school enrollment was over 90%. That means that we put a lot of emphasis on education. Even though people were starving, they still sent their children to school. They didn't want their children to work instead of taking education. So that's one thing that is common to these countries. I think another thing is kind of Confucian influence.
Interesting.
I don't want to be cultural about these economic, developments and social development, but we have a book by Max Weber who argued the connection between Protestant ethics and capitalism.
Yeah.
Like that, there have already been people who thought influence of culture or influence of religion or influence of philosophy is important for development, economic developments. If we apply that to Asia, all these Confucian influenced economies made quite good success. I don't know if there is any established theory about it, but that's one thing that is common to these so-called four dragons. And there are, you can probably, if you talk to business administration professors, they can come up with more about what I'm talking about. But even so, even if that's true, I don't know if there is any formula when it comes to development.
Yeah.
A formula meaning if that's applied to a certain country, anyone can achieve development.
On April the 9th, we're going to have a dialogue. I hope it's going to also be a debate between Jason Furman, who was the Obama administration's chief economic advisor, and Professor Justin Nifu Lin. And recently, when I met Jason, he said something very interesting. He said his favorite industrial policy is just investment in human capital, just to do education better. And when you said that, it's also your impression that the kind of minimum resonance or overlap between these success stories is that they invested a lot, right, in the next generation. And now you're a professor at Kyunghee Daehakyu. So it makes me think that if Confucian ethics goes straight into the emphasis on education and human capital, and there is a mechanism that can link Confucian ethics with economic performance, right?
Yeah.
So that could as well be maybe an update on Weber's theory. Yeah.
That might have worked for these countries, but the way I see it, after you reach a certain level of economic development, what you need is social development, which would probably include concepts of gender equality, concepts of reducing inequalities. And at that stage, I think it helps if you are a democracy, if you turn into a democracy. That's what I believe. But, and I noticed from your website, you described yourself as a humanist, right? I think I also consider myself a humanist. And if we believe in humanism, then I think we need to identify ourselves as humans. What I mean is, these days I fear that we all have a little problem of identity. Identity meaning when we are a child, we identify ourselves with our family, with our community, with our school, and then at a certain stage of our life, we start to identify ourselves as a citizen of certain country, certain nation. And in our international system, nation state is so powerful that we are stuck there. Once we start to identify ourselves as a national of a certain country, that's it. We are stuck there. It's very difficult for us to identify ourselves as, for example, Asian, identify ourselves as a global citizen. Theoretically, that's possible, that's important, but in our mind and heart, it's not easy
Yeah.
because we are stuck there. And nation states are so powerful. We are living in a world of, sovereign equality.
Yeah.
So these nation states are so powerful, and states have their own dynamics. They tend to consolidate their power, and they, we see a lot of phenomenon these days in our world where states are fighting more, if more than in the past,
Yeah.
and they are strengthening their power through consolidation of national unity and solidarity as a nation. So we see rise of nationalism when we actually need to see more global cooperation,
Yeah.
more global mindset, which is very difficult.
Yeah.
But I believe that what we need is to identify ourselves more broadly. For example, as Asian, as a global citizen, as an earthling. It would be easier if there is an invasion by aliens. Then all of a sudden we can identify ourselves as earthlings. We run into
Yeah. Yeah.
Koreans run into Japanese and oh, are you an earthling too? Oh,
That's
I'm an earthling too. We are fellow earthlings.
Planetary consciousness.
Let's just
Yeah,
fight
yeah.
these damn aliens,
Yeah.
But unfortunately, aliens are not here, not invading us without help of alien invasion. We need to be able to think of ourselves as global citizens, as earthlings.
Yeah.
That's what I think we need in this globalized world.
Yeah. Well, that's a great thought experiment, but also a very telling testimony to, I think, what we can all learn from Korea, because sometimes we forget that Korea witnesses and still lives in the pain of fitting a culture and a civilization into the framework of nation states and being carved into nation states, right, in the peninsula. And the unhealed wounds are still there, but not everyone thinks about it nowadays outside Korea. So there's a lot we can learn from it now that we go into similar civil wars and international wars around the world. So it's definitely becoming a more divided world, while at the same time the entire planet is facing, if not aliens, at least we're facing major natural disasters in the future, right? With rising sea levels or the just deterioration of the environment. If we don't just completely fail in our effort to elevate ourselves socioeconomically, at least we're being threatened by these natural disasters. So that's very interesting. And when you mentioned you were a humanist, I thought, well, in a literal sense, you were a humanist. You were studying humanities, right? In college, you did your studies in French literature, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you got from. Were you trying to be a literary scholar? Were you trying to be a poet? Were you trying to be a journalist? What was the trajectory? Yeah.
I think I became a humanist quite recently, not from my college, but before that, I don't mean that Koreans are able to identify themselves more broadly than other nationals. I'm not saying that, because when you are actually witnessing what is happening in Korea, especially something like political polarization, I don't know if we are able to expand our identity and think of ourselves more as human, as Asian, as a global citizen, rather than nationals of South Korea. I don't know if that is happening. I hope it's going to happen, but I don't know if that is happening. And if you look at other countries as well in our world, so some leading democracies, what is happening there is that some politicians are trying to encourage people to identify themselves more narrowly rather than broadly.
Yes. Yes.
Sometimes they are, identifying themselves as a member of a special ethnic group, as 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 someone who is promoting the importance of his or her own country only. Don't care what happens to other country. What is happening to my country is the most important. It's almost opposite to global citizenship mindset. When we actually need in this world, which is globalized, so we have a lot of global issues that came from globalization. So no one country, none of the countries can handle these issues by themselves. We need more global cooperation. We need more global mindset. Someone has to always think about the earth and the world.
Yeah.
But I don't know why, but there is more tendency, even among leading countries, to look at them more narrowly. My country is most important. My nation is most important. That kind of attitude, including South Korea. What I mean is, it is partly because of political polarization that is common among many, even advanced democracies. So that's something that worries me.
Yeah. Well, we're here in the U.S. Although it's far-fetched and maybe anachronistic to talk about civil wars, but at least we're in a state of civil strife. In that kind of very raw Thucydidean terms, there are different visions for how to do it, how to do the political experiment, the American political project, right? So it's a very tough time when you're calling us to think more globally and universally, while we cannot even handle not only domestic but like civil and even regional and local understandings of what we're doing, why we are together with each other, and that I think that crisis shows itself in the discourse on human rights. I wanted to ask you a bit about that because you champion human rights at the UN. There are usually two tensions that people point to when it comes to human rights. So one is, well, you served in Singapore, there's a whole debate between human rights being genealogically Western and on the other hand, there is this idea of the Asian values, but it's beyond that. There are all kinds of values. There are cultural civilizational understandings of what are our priorities, really. And how do you reconcile between human rights as a Western concept and the other more indigenous understandings of what really counts? And on the other hand, there is a whole kind of, I guess this is also a rhetoric we hear from South Asia, from East Asia, and from Africa. Development, right? Poverty alleviation. These are actually empowering human beings to think about stuff like rights as a first world problem. So therefore, the conclusion is human rights is a luxury. It's something that we should not worry about at the moment. We should just develop. How do you understand these two debates?
I think some people think human rights is a Western value, Western concept, probably because the moves to realize human rights for all started in Europe. We know that the first governments that realized human rights in terms of their Constitution were the American and French, both through revolutions in the 18th century. And these revolutions were different from any others because they not only drove out the kings, the monarchy, but also they declared that they don't need any monarchy anymore, which was a crazy idea at that time. If you can drive any king out, that happened for many years in human history, including in Roman years. You can drive out, take down emperors, you can take down kings, but you replace them with another king, always. But what they were saying was, we don't need any more kings. We are going to elect someone who's gonna rule our country for a certain period of time, limited time. That is what we call democracy, right? And because that's studied in France, in United States, in UK, we tend to think it is a Western concept. You know, democracy and human rights are closely linked to each other by their nature. But if you try to look over a longer period of human history, in my opinion, human rights, meaning individual freedom, has always expanded over many years. It never went back. What I mean is, if you compare 5,000 years ago to 500 years ago and 50 years ago, when human history started, power was always in the hands of few people, and then it expanded. They realized that we need, especially with the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago, people had more economic choices. People had more economic freedom. And then they thought they could have more, political freedom as well. They wanted to choose their own leaders. So all of these process was going to the direction in which, freedom was expanded more and more to people. And instead of concentrating. And by now, I think about 70% of all the countries in the world are democratic or partially democratic, according to, indexes like
Yes,
Economist Index or whatever.
Different flaws.
Freedom House
ways.
Index,
Yeah.
whichever you use. And that's a lot of increase from, let's say, if you compare it to 40 years ago. 40 years ago, even if you put democracy and partial democracies together, it was only 40% of all the countries in the world. Now it's 70% of all the countries. I think it's going to increase more and more. So there is this direction in which, history evolves. So I don't think it's Western value, Western concept.
Okay.
It's just a human thing. And the way I see it, globalism has a lot to do with individualism. Because if you think we are all humans, we are all same, we have the equal right, then, we are all part of this world. We are all part of humanity. And between globalism and individualism, there is nationalism. And the way I see nationalism is going down.
You're cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
So I now see where the littérature française comes in. You are a believer in the Enlightenment idea of human progressivity. And you believe the direction is broadly, yes, we do have anti-globalist and populist democratic backslides, but you still believe that we're heading in the cosmopolitan direction overall in the macro historical sense. Is that right, or am I putting it in your mouth?
I heard someone using the term deglobalization. Deglobalize.
Okay.
I think that's a wrong term.
Okay.
I would describe it as resistance to globalization.
Okay.
Because, as I said, nation states have been there for many years, and they have tendency to consolidate their power, not the other way around. So they resist. But I think the overall trend is for more individual freedom. And people are, interacting and exchanging with other people at the level of people.
At the people level, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then we realize that we are all humans.
Yes. Yes.
That's humanist.
That's humanism.
What you are.
That's humanism. Thank you. And what you are as well. So let me connect the discussion of human rights to what we talked about on multilateralism. Something I noticed interestingly in your CV, I've also looked at yours, is that you were both, I mean, when you were a permanent representative to the UN, I think you chaired or presided over or represented Korea at both the Economic and Social Council and at the Security Council at one point, right? So when we think about North Korea, I mean, tying the idea of human rights to peace and security, or just broadly, not just about the Korean Peninsula, but around the world, what is the connection between values such as human rights or other values, we're going to be more inclusive, and settlement of peace, resolution of security risks? What is the point of connection there? Does it work well, or are there challenges to this approach, right, of putting the values and security together? Because we can also be pragmatic about security. Let's say, okay, let's stop worrying too much about the values and just get it done. Or, you know, we could also say, well, the values are central to the way you're doing it, right? What's your thinking here?
Well, when you talk about the United Nations, I usually prefer using the term global governance rather than multilateralism, because, you know, not only the United Nations but international organizations as a whole, and also international agreements, treaties, all of them provide a certain level of global governance. If you think about it, you know, one of the first international organizations that started in the 19th century was UPU, Universal Postal Union. So they made agreement, they meaning nation states, which have sovereign power. They made agreement that they will allow free exchange of letters, mails, international mails, because that works for all of them.
Yeah.
So, you know, actually accepting mails coming from other countries into their country without intervention is, in a way, a little compromise on their sovereign power, isn't it? Because sovereignty means that you can do whatever you want to do within your borders. But you promise that, okay, these mails are coming, we will just deliver them to their destination without any intervention. That's compromise. But they agreed on this compromise on their sovereign power because it works for all of them, you know, mutually beneficial. But it's more difficult to expand this kind of global governance to other areas, more sensitive areas like peace and security, or reducing inequalities. You know, all countries are sensitive to that.
Yeah.
So it's a question of how much global governance we can achieve through these international organizations, international agreements. And, you know, recently we see that the United Nations, the global governance provided by the United Nations is not very effective, you know, not least because permanent members of the Security Council have veto power, and when they break or threaten peace, you know, there's not much we can do about it. Even the United Nations doesn't have much to do about it. So global governance by the United Nations is under threat. But that does not mean that we don't need the United Nations. We don't need multilateralism. We need more global governance, actually, because, you know, we are living in a world that is very much globalized. So in the past, if you don't want to mix with people who have different religion, who have different ethnicity, then you don't have to mix with them, you know. you don't meet them actually. You know, people.
Yeah.
I think my grandfather, who was born in the 19th century, I think he never traveled 500 kilometers from his birthplace, beyond 500 kilometers from his birthplace. So you don't have to mix with other people. You don't have to interact with other people. But we are living in a globalized world.
Yeah.
Nobody can live like that.
Yeah.
So we need global governance. So if the United Nations doesn't work, then we should think about how to make it work.
Yeah.
You know, some people say, how about just canceling the United Nations and establishing a new one? My answer is, what difference does it make? We are talking about same ingredients.
Yeah.
You know, we are talking about same nation states, 190 of them in the world. So whether you call it United Nations or the League of Nations, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
It's just a question about how much global governance we can achieve.
And sometimes that ongoing debate over what to do with the United Nations, how do you revise it, how do you reform it, how do you reauthor it? If you reauthor it, then this time with whom, right? That also has to do with the agency of back in the days Korea was not participating in the norm making, and there was this famous episode in The Hague, right, where the Korean representative went there to lobby for Korean sovereignty, was not heard, and he ended his own life. And I went to that museum, which I think a lot of Korean presidents visited, Joon. And but sometimes that question gets simplified into this pointed challenge to the Security Council, because this is the part that people want reformed the most. What are your thoughts on this question? I get a lot from my international law colleagues. How do you reform something like the Security Council? It's so historically specific, right? Is that even reformable?
Well, people think reform of Security Council is the most important among all reforms of United Nations, because, understandably, because the Security Council is the most powerful international organ in human history. You know, until the League of Nations, that was a predecessor to the United Nations, they thought that enforcement on sovereign states is not possible. States are all sovereign, and they have this principle of sovereign equality. So how can you enforce a state to do something or not to do something when this state is sovereign?
Yeah.
So the League didn't have that kind of power.
Yeah.
League was a paper tiger, only barking without biting. So during the Second World War, they got together, and after the end of the war, they thought they would create another universal international organization that would have enforcement capability, which was realized in the name of the Security Council. Security Council has enforcement power under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and all UN member states, when they joined the United Nations, they accepted. Under Article 25, they promised that they would carry out decisions by the Security Council without knowing them in advance. That's a very big compromise on sovereign power. So that's how the United Nations, for the first time in history, has a capability to enforce states to do something or not to do something. But problem is the 5 permanent members who were the founders of the United Nations, they thought this kind of enforcement shouldn't be targeting themselves. They need privileges. So they have veto power.
They do. Yeah.
If you look at the negotiations for establishment of the United Nations, they indicate that they will not join the United Nations if they are not given such privilege. If these 5 countries don't join United Nations, what's the point? There's no point in having an international organization. The original member was only 51. So they gave privileges to these countries. But the problem is these privileges are written on the stone. You cannot change it unless you amend the charter. They hardly amend the charter. And so, how to reform the Security Council is a tough question. But I don't have any magic formula. But the way I see it, while we need to recognize the reality of international relations, meaning big countries, whether in terms of population or in terms of national power, in terms of economic power, big countries should have more say in decision making. But they should come up with an institutional way of doing that, rather than just, these 5 countries are big countries, let's write their names on the stone. That was not the right way. They ask me, then what kind of other ways of doing that? For example, in the United Nations, they have what is called financial contribution rates for each member, and they recalculate these rates every 3 years, taking into account, GDP, national debt, everything. So economic indicators keep changing. So every 3 years they recalculate. You can come up with something like that, or even you can apply what they have in the United States in terms of federation. U.S. federal system. If you look at their Congress, they have Senate and House of Representatives, and in the Senate, all the 50 states of the United States, each of them has 2 senators. Whether it's a big state like California or small state like Delaware, all of them have 2 senators because they used to be sovereign in the past. But in the lower house, House of Representatives, representatives are elected according to population. So California has much more representatives than Delaware. So we can think of something like that in the international system if we want to reform the United Nations, in which, big countries, big states have more say in decision making, compared to smaller countries. But there should be a reasonable way of doing that is acceptable to states.
So China and Russia and the U.S. would be senators, and Korea would be congressmen. But this is for some reason, this is the first time I hear this. And if we take the cue from the bicameral political system within nation states, there could be a multi-cameral, multi-house, right, set up at the UN, so that the different way of congregating nation states to project their voice and cast their vote could also be less monolithic. Right now it's very monolithic, right? So we can maybe diversify that.
Well, the U.S. federal system is not the only example.
Yeah.
If you look at the decision making within the European Union, European Council, also they have big countries have more say. European Parliament, members of European Parliament is elected on the basis of population. So Germany has more members of European Parliament. And if you look at World Bank, countries members have different voting power depending on how much they contributed to the World Bank in the beginning.
That's very interesting. We talked about the big nations, and we know there are smaller nations, and the Pacific Island nations are very much threatened by the rising sea levels. We're just here with Ambassador of Fiji to China, Robert Lee, and we talked about small nations. I wanted to ask about middle powers. This is a term I hear from Professor Ha-In Sun from Moon Chung-Yin and from other Korean IR scholars. They use this concept a lot, and I wonder what that means for you. And because you were a professional diplomat from a middle power, is that just a designation of a power that is empirically, materialistically neither big nor small, and we, for the lack of a better term, we just lump them together and say they're middle powers and use them in academic papers, or is there a specific kind of agency attributed to these powers, and there's some coordinated political work they are uniquely capable of doing?
Well, to me, the term middle power just describes, states that are neither big nor small.
Okay.
So, in relative terms, if you line up all 193 UN member states, you can do that in terms of their population, largest population to the smallest population. You can do that in terms of their economic GDP. You can do that in terms of their military power. So you have many ways of lining up states. And middle power probably mean, states that are standing in the middle. But when some Korean scholars are using it, I think what they try to indicate is that we are not a big country, but we can do a lot for our size. I think that's what they mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they are using that term towards domestic audience. I don't know if it has any other meaning.
Yeah. Well, maybe they're if Korea takes on the leadership of building these coalitions, I guess one mechanism would be, well, it's not the same as when China and the US start a coalition, it's perceived as a geopolitical realignment. Whereas if Korea starts something, we just think, oh, this is going to be like multilateral. Well, you are the deputy minister for multilateral and global affairs. Do you think maybe Korea is better at doing this precisely because it is not a great geopolitical power?
Well, if someone sees the world as something like the world during the Cold War, for example, the whole world is divided into two camps. So we used to have a group of countries that called themselves non-aligned, So we don't belong to either of these two camps. But I don't know if you can use the term middle power like that, because I don't think the world is, a lot of people, think now we have new Cold War, now we have new polarization in the world, but I don't think of the world that way. I think of the world as more like 193 of nation states, that are all different.
Yeah, aligned in various ways.
Yeah, various ways.
Very mosaic.
Yeah,
very
depending on which way you cut.
Exactly. Okay, that's great. That's very helpful. You mentioned Cold War. We talked about the historical context in which the Security Council was formed. There was a lot of history in it, and before we started the podcast, you told me about your grandfather and your father. Your father was a diplomat. That was very interesting to know. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the role of historical memories. And Korea has certainly a lot of historical memories in its IR thinking. So what is the role of historical memories, and why should we heed and hear that?
Well, earlier I told you that when I started out as a diplomat, South Korea was a relatively poor country, and our international capability was very limited. So our diplomacy, our foreign policy was mostly focused on issues that mattered to us, like Korean Peninsula issue, until 1991, when the two Koreas became members of the United Nations. There was always confrontation between the two Koreas in any international fora. So South Korea's, diplomatic power was focusing on that confrontation. So we were not able to, think more about other issues. But things have changed. So, I told you that my late father was also a diplomat during the First Republic. During the First Republic of Korea, which was from 1948 through 1960, the most important event was the Korean War of 1950 to 53. So, it was not just a diplomatic confrontation with North Korea, it was real fight, battle. So, understandably, most of our diplomatic capability was focusing on that kind of issue. So I think probably it was after 1990s that South Korea, was able to consider other issues, global issues, for example, what we can do about how we can contribute to global governance, as I mentioned. We do have global governance in our world, and what we can do about it. But you also mentioned middle power. Whether it's middle power or small power, countries that are not great powers, for them, I think it is beneficial to have more rule-based international relations. For example, earlier I mentioned 4 dragons, and even if we include China, all these East Asian economic powers have benefited a great deal from globalization, because they export a lot more than importing, and that was a driving force in their economic growth. You have this famous what is called elephant curve by World Bank economist Milanovic, and that shows how East Asian countries benefited a lot from globalization, probably at the expense of middle class in developed countries. So
with our comparative advantage, taking in a lot of industrial manufacturing, and now that we're innovating as well, right? Yeah. And I guess the Asian economies are really the more vocal upholders of the that global economic order nowadays, when the U.S. is rethinking its commitments to it. That's really interesting. And if I may ask a little bit more of a sensitive question in Northeast Asian context, now that claims of historical revisionism returns, and there is this spat right between China and Japan, and there is a whole ranges of interconstitutional arguments. What can we learn from the Korean perspective? There's how can we do this better? How can we take stock of, but not be chained to historical memories, but build better relations?
That is a tough question. I think at the fundamental level, we can get over with that if we all become global citizens, as I mentioned. But that's not very likely in the near future.
Right.
And not least because, political forces in these countries, whether a country is democratic or not, all of them, have the need to rally their own people, around their nationalism. So it's difficult to think out of the box, even though that might be needed eventually. So in the meantime, even though we are competing, even though we are rallying around nationalism, we can we can do it more rationally. We can do it more, you know, on kind of level playing field with more balanced eyes, so that we don't drive ourselves to an extreme. You know, we sometimes see that in our relations. So we always need to control ourselves. We always need to think that eventually what is good for all of us is to maintain peace, to avoid confrontation, and to promote cooperation, so that our peoples can, you know, enjoy more prosperity, enjoy more freedom.
Yeah. On the note of prosperity, sometimes I think that the way we teach international relations in the U.S. In the old big theory mode ignores the people, the marginal voices, and the vulnerable communities that fall into the gaps between big power and big theories. I don't know how Kyung-hee teaches IR now that you're a professor there, but you certainly pay a lot of attention to this matter when you were still in diplomacy professionally, but now, of course, you are working a lot, right, on issues of children, on issues of disabilities. How did these your diplomatic work interstate in this very classical kind of 19th century diplomatic way? How did that square with your intense and profound interest in the plight of the vulnerable communities, and how are you working on that right now?
Well, I told you that I became a humanist relatively recently, which means that, you know, when I was a diplomat, I, like any other diplomat, I worked for my own country's national interests. My country's national interests were always top priority. But while working, you know, in the United Nations and around global issues, what I realized is that after all, we are all humans. And as I said, you know, having a narrow way of identifying ourselves, identifying meaning us versus them. Who are us? Who are we? You know, you can think we are a group of people. We are people who have who belong to the same ethnic group. You can think we are people who belong to the same nation. We are people who belong to the same region of the world. You know, there are many different ways of identifying ourselves, but I thought, and I realized that if we identify ourselves as humans, then we are all, everyone is valuable, everyone has human dignity, everyone has every right to live in peace and enjoy prosperity, you know, then you tend to focus on vulnerable groups of society, because to realize that, you need to take care of vulnerable groups in your society. So whether you're talking about human rights or sustainable development, you know, the principle, the most important principle of sustainable development goals is leaving no one behind, which means that you focus on the most vulnerable group, and then you achieve everything for all of society.
Yeah. This is deep in civil society, or deep in this work, Save the Children initiatives, and also with people with disabilities. Sometimes large international organizations or large governments, really, where you worked in the past, are accused of adopting and deploying the language of sustainability or shared prosperity without really being able to deliver it. There's this charge of empty signifiers. Oh, we care a lot about CSR, SDG, and every company now has an SDG page, right? But it doesn't mean you can balance the tension between finance and practice. It doesn't mean that you can get things done. How can we do these things like the 2030 agenda better and more effectively?
Well, the overall estimate of how we are doing in terms of achieving the SDGs is not very good. One reason is because I was part of the negotiations for SDGs.
Oh, right.
SDGs were negotiated during the 3 years when I was UN ambassador. So I was part of negotiations. I know the negotiation very well, and all these goals were very ambitious from the beginning. It was not meant to be achieved 100%. For example, if you read the first goal, SDG 1, eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere by 2030. Is it possible?
Right.
You can eradicate poverty from the world by 2030, which was not possible from the beginning. But we had that debate. But people who thought these are goals, so we should have ambitious goals rather than practical goals.
Okay.
So that's how we ended up with
I see.
ambitious
So that was in
goals.
the conversation.
Yeah,
People
that
were
was
already
in the
raising this is impractical.
Yeah, even when we were negotiating.
Yeah.
So, in other words, they are not meant to be achieved 100%. So you shouldn't be too disappointed that they are not achieved. But still, only about 35% of SDGs have been on track or make some progress. That is not very, satisfactory. And one of the reasons, other than the goals being ambitious from the beginning, one of the reasons is because, well, two of the reasons are because of the pandemic for 3 years, and also the ongoing armed conflicts, the wars. So, to achieve SDGs, you need financing for development. And funding should be coming from, the same countries, about 30 countries in the world that are in OECD. And if they have to use their funding to address other issues like pandemic fighting or expenses for wars, then naturally funding for the SDGs will go down.
Right.
So that's what happened.
Yeah. I see. What I hear throughout the conversation is not a naive but a very sober kind of optimism and cosmopolitanism, if I can impose that tag on you. And I guess I will end this conversation with a simple question for those who are discontent and disillusioned, who think that humanity is destroying itself and there's no return. What is your call and advocacy for still staying in there and feeling that there is hope?
Well, those who are more on the pessimistic side, they have reasons to be pessimistic, I think, yeah. And, well, I'm afraid they might be right, but, as a member of humanity, both you and me, we all know that whether if you believe in God, religion, then God might have given this to us. If you believe in Darwinian evolution, it might be just the result of evolution, but we all know that survival is the most important goal, priority for everything that is alive, all living creatures. We eat to survive as an individual. We mate to survive as species. So the drive to eat and to mate, nobody can resist it. So that's programmed in us. I don't know where it comes from. It depends on whether you are religious, but we know that. So that means that we need to make every effort to survive as humanity.
Yeah. So part of the humanism and part of it is
Yeah.
the normative utopian vision, but also part of it is how we're wired into desiring survival and peace and prosperity and living better lives.
So that's why I'm saying pessimists, you know, have reason to believe like that. But what's the point of being pessimistic?
Right.
And what's the point of predicting that we are all doomed?
Right. Not utter nihilism, which neither of us is. So on that note of shared humanism, thank you so much.
Thank you.
옹대사, 옹대사님 매우 감사합니다. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you.